we're going to get right into it. Here you can see me tracing the tang of the knife onto a piece of black walnut that I plan to use as handle material, also called scales. I'll trace the profile out, cut that out, and then I'll split the block down the middle and have 2 slabs for each side of the tang. And here I am using a digital caliper to find the center of the block so I can kind of know where to cut it down the center with the bandsaw. I should probably be using a push block or something along those lines here, but I am not. And at this point I'm just trying to get the bandsaw marks out of the scales and get them nice and flat on both sides. I think I'm using a 36 grit ceramic belt that's pretty well used. It's a pretty worn belt. I try not to switch from wood to steel on the same belts. Just dedicate some for wood and some for steel, and try not to cross over. It seems like the wood clogs up the ceramic belts pretty quickly. But I'll use an old file to kind of rough up the belt once in a while and get through some fresh grit. And I'm just trying to get some contour at the top of where the scales will be, right where they'll meet the bevels of the knife. You want to pay attention to that before you get too far along. You want to make sure that the top of the scales are finished before you glue them up to the knife, because it's very hard to sand the top of the scales when they're epoxied in. And doing some more hand sanding before I etch the blade in ferric chloride. I believe I finished with a 600 grit hand sand finish. And the ferric just kind of gives it a nice satin finish. It's kind of gray, and I'm a pretty big fan of it. And like I said in previous videos, on the higher grits, 400 and above, I use Windex. But on the low grits, I use WD-40 as a lubricant. And I don't show video of every grit that I pass through, so this may not show the Windex in use, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take place. Just try to keep the videos as interesting as I can, but also thorough, so you can actually see every single step. And this is what it's looking like right before we etch it in the ferric chloride. We've got a 600 grit hand sand finish. And I just let it spin a couple minutes in the straight ferric chloride, then take it to the sink. I wash it with the 4/0 steel wool and a little bit of soap. And there's the satin finish. And now it's time to glue up the scales. I use a 2-part epoxy. It's a 5-minute epoxy. And when you see me wiping down the blade and wiping down the scales, I'm typically using a paper towel with acetone on it, which you'll see me do quite a few times. And I use a little bit of black pigment in my epoxy just as a habit. It's probably not necessary, but I just like using a little bit of pigment. You shouldn't ever actually see the epoxy, and it's probably a waste of time, but it's just kind of a habit. And my method for gluing up the scales is to glue one side on and clamp it, let it set up, and then drill and then glue the other side on, and then drill through the entire knife, and then install the rivets. So probably not the most efficient method to glue up scales, but it's just something I'm in the habit of doing this way. And at some point I want to start using mechanical fasteners instead of just straight pins, but this has worked just fine for me. I've never had any issues as far as scale durability. And after I've got all the clamps on and tight, I'll make a pass with a few Q-tips at the top of the scales to make sure that we don't have any squeeze out that's touching the blade. I'll do a few wipes with a dry Q-tip, and then the last couple of wipes I'll use a Q-tip with some acetone on it. And here it is, that's after it's set up for a good 24 hours or more. And then I'll scrape whatever epoxy kind of hung around, clean it with acetone, and take it to the drill press and drill out my 2 pinholes. I use a piece of masking tape on the scale and a fresh drill bit, or at least a sharp one that's dedicated just to wood. The masking tape seems to help with minimizing tear out. Now you'll see me filling up those small little holes that we drilled throughout the tang, just as added strength to hold the scales on. I'll try to fill them pretty thoroughly before clamping the other scale down. And I'll get the clamps on just kind of gently, and then get things lined up as well as I can, and then clamp them all the way down. It's very important that you get them clamped while they're as straight as they can possibly be. You want to make sure that the scale doesn't slide around forward, backwards, up, down, any direction you don't want it to be. Otherwise you'll be breaking them off after the fact. And after they set up for a good 24 hours or more, we take the clamps off, drill the other scale out, and get ready to drive the pins through. Masking tape again to help minimize tear out. And again, most of my bits come from McMaster Car, and they seem to be very good quality bits. Now I'm planning to use tubing as the pins for this knife, and I use a 220 grit sanding block to just kind of rough up the finish on the pins to give the epoxy something to grip to. The factory finish is pretty oily and smooth, and kind of resists epoxy, so roughing it up a little bit's never a bad idea. And I'm just using some worn 320 grit or 220 grit for that. And then I'll smooth the tip of the tubing as well so it doesn't cut into the scale when I'm driving it in. And I'm using a tubing cutter to cut the tubes. You could use just a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder or Dremel tool, but I had this handy, so I decided to use it this way. Very little waste if you decide to use a tool like this. And the tubing is very thin-walled, so something to keep in mind. It's pretty tricky to drive in. You'll see that I use it's a 1-inch square block with a hole drilled into it, and I'll use that to just give me a hole to kind of drive the pin into once it starts to go all the way through the knife. I'll have to lift it off the table and then drive it through the hole in the steel bar. And there we are, driving it through. First thing I'm doing on grinding the scales down is trying to take some of the thickness out of the scales. It's kind of tricky to do this without overheating the epoxy on the rivets. So you'll see me spending quite a bit of time just keeping things cool and just checking the temperature with my hands. If it's too hot to handle, it's likely too hot for the epoxy. So I just kind of focus on keeping things cool. And I'm grinding a little bit of excess on the profile right here. I'm fairly limited with this grinder as far as contouring goes. If you get kind of a nicer 2x72 grinder with different attachments and different wheels, you can get into these contours. But with a Grizzly, you're pretty limited to either an 8-inch wheel, a 10-inch wheel, or the flat platen. So on a contoured handle, you're kind of left to your own devices. For the inside of the handle, I use a few different rasps to get the contour. Switch from just a round rasp to a half round file, and then from there I'll switch to sandpaper. And I'll use a variety of sanding blocks. I've got some 1/2-inch steel pipe, I've got 1/2-inch wooden dowels, some Durablocks, and just different things, just depending on the grit that I'm using and what exactly I'm trying to accomplish. With the lower grits, you want a firmer sanding block, and then with the higher grits, you want some softer backed sanding blocks. The Durablocks are typically used with bodywork on vehicles and different things, so I highly recommend those. They have a lot of different sizes, and they're very comfortable to use. But the steel pipe gets a lot of work done pretty quickly too, so. I use a file card to clean out the teeth on the rasp pretty frequently. It seems like the cleaner you keep it, the faster it cuts and the better it works. We've moved on to sanding. Start out with a 120 grit and move up from there. And all the handle sanding, all the wood sanding is done dry. And here's a clip of the Durablock being used. I've had these for years and they're very comfortable to use. Although they're fairly soft, so they really would only work on some of the higher grits. I typically use adhesive backed paper, like a 3M with a 120 grit or so with the Durablocks. And I think I have paper from maybe 180 to 320. And with the tapered tang, it can be tricky to clamp the knife in the vise. Use a small wooden wedge to help hold it in there. And we go through the same process on the bottom of the knife as we did everywhere else. We use the rasps and then move on to the sandpaper. Now you can kind of see how things are coming along. Definitely have a lot of thickness to remove. And you could probably eliminate some of this at the bandsaw initially. I use a small machinist ruler to figure out where my thickness should be, and I typically go for a 1/4 inch thickness on each scale. So I have a 1/2 inch thickness on the scales, not including the tang. And for a tapered tang, this seems to work pretty well. And here we are taking the bulk of the thickness out of the scales. And like I said earlier, trying not to overheat the pins is the most difficult part of this process. It ends up taking quite a bit of time just trying to keep things cool. And here you can see that we've got the thickness right about where we need it to be. Starting to look like an actual handle. Now we're going to start contouring on the 10-inch wheel. I usually do some pretty basic contouring at the top of the scales, the bottom of the scales, and then just all the hard, sharp edges I'll knock off with a 60 grit belt, and then hand sand the rest of the contour in and keep most of my thicknesses under control with hand sanding. And I'll typically do a 600 grit finish on the scales. So we'll start with a 120 or so and move up from there. These knife making vices are really nice to use when it comes to contouring handles. The one I have, it doesn't seem to be rigid enough to hold things when I'm kind of really working on steel, but for contouring and things like this, it's perfect. And the sandpaper I'm using is Rhino Wet. Tubing I used on the scales is something I saw with like train set tools and different things. Like if you're into making model train sets, they sell small brass tubing and different things. So if you go to Hobby Lobby or another craft store and look at the miniatures used in train sets, you can find some pretty interesting tubing. And we're on the final stretch. Some pretty basic contouring, but it feels very nice in the hand. For the scales, I used a beeswax finish that I buffed into the scales. And after buffing with beeswax, I'll just use a clean shop towel and hand rub any of the excess off. Seems like the heat from rubbing it pretty much takes care of any kind of gumminess or any kind of stickiness from the beeswax. It's a pretty nice natural finish. I haven't used it too many times, but I've become quite a big fan of it. And that's a big block of beeswax. I use a fairly firm wheel on this. And I'm just finishing it up now. I know this series has been pretty long, and I appreciate you guys watching. I've got one more installment, and then we'll be completely done with this one. Thanks for watching.